So this is the last panel discussion of the 2-day session, and it's probably one of the most difficult. So we are calling on an expert trying to do the enviable job of navigating this particular discussion. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Elif Ekinci, who is the director of the Australian Centre for Accelerating Diabetes Innovation, ACADI, and head of diabetes at Austin Health in Melbourne. And she is a clinician, a scientist, and academic, endocrinology. And her research focuses on the pathophysiology, prevention, and treatments of diabetes. And welcome, and good luck with this session.
Thank you, Dorota. Thanks, everyone, for joining me for this final panel discussion. So really, it's about embedding new therapies and new technologies across type 1, people living with type 1 diabetes across all ages. I'd like to initially acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay respects to elders present, past and emerging. And you've met most of the panellists today. However, I'm just going to ask Ben, Nash, and Jonathan, Salmon, Fergus, Cameron, and Laura Knecht, if they're here, you can say a few words, please, to introduce yourselves. Yep.
Fergus Cameron, I'm a children's doctor from Melbourne, paediatric endocrinologist.
Thanks.
I'm Laura Knecht. I'm an adult endocrinologist. I was in clinical practice before joining industry with Prevention Bio, now Sanofi.
I'm Ben. I've had 30 plus years of lived experience, so 2 decades of personal experience living with type 1, but also the son of a father and a mother with type 1, and the brother of a sister with type 1, and hilariously, my partner of 8 years just got diagnosed with type 1 a few months ago, so very significant lived experience. Also, in my spare time, I'm doing a PhD with ACADI. Elif's my supervisor, and in my final months of endocrinology training.
Oh my gosh.
Mm-hmm. Jonathan Salmon, that's a pretty hard act to follow. And I don't have a scientific background. I'm a volunteer for JDRF, and I think I'm here in the context of being a parent of a child with type 1.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start off by asking my first question to the panel. So how do we efficiently implement new therapies as they're approved? So we heard a little bit about some of the clinical trials that are happening in type 2 diabetes, and mind you, there's a lot happening in type 2 diabetes, in particular with reference to complications. But very small numbers, maybe less than 5% of these trials are in people with type 1 diabetes. So what do we need to do to try to enable more participation from people with type 1 diabetes? So I'm going to ask, perhaps I might ask, Jonathan and Ben to comment from the lived experience perspective, and then I'll ask Louise and Laura and Jeff and Mark to comment as well.
Do you want me to start?
After you,
yeah. Well, I think overall, I would say that's not a bad development because, if we can increase the commercial size of the pie and attract more money to the area, I think that's a good thing overall. So I guess as long as the outcome's there, the participation of type 1s is probably less important, I think education is obviously the key in this, and I think that's an area that we're perhaps not doing well in. And certainly my lived experience with patients is varying levels of education as to what the complications are and can be. And I think that is certainly the secret to increasing the participation.
Thanks, John. Okay.
I think we've got a really engaged community. If you look at what we've done, I don't think there's ever been a user-led, FDA-approved intervention before, and the open source automated insulin delivery is one of those. So you've got a pretty engaged community that are really keen to be involved in research. Obviously, type 2 diabetes, in the past, there's been issues with medications that has resulted in them needing to do cardiovascular outcome trials that are mandated. So you've got these big trials with big outcomes. Obviously, the type 1 population, it's a bit more technical. There's risks of DKA and severe hypo, and everyone's on insulin. So we're less commercially I guess when you're looking at industry-led trials, it's a less commercially viable group, and it's also difficult to do the trials. So I think there's a couple of barriers, but we've definitely got a very engaged community that's more than happy to be involved, I would think.
Okay, thanks. And Laura and Louise and Mark?
Sure. So, new therapies are tough it's difficult to implement them. It's difficult for patients, it's difficult for healthcare providers, it's difficult, it's something I come from the US, so getting things approved and getting things set up doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it, and once you learn how to do it, and once you have those established and in place, things can move forward, and then it's not as difficult the next time and the next time. And I think really, that's where education is so important, but also relying on other people. So patients can help healthcare providers, hopefully industry can help both groups as well. And then of course we can see here with JDRF with this fantastic presentation that's going on, everyone working together and helping to move things forward.
Thanks.
Me? I think partnering with people with lived experience, as Ben said, it's a great community, and to partner from the get-go in conception and co-design and implementation is critical to success. And then the other thing, I think for remote and regional, it's a huge challenge because of lack of capacity and infrastructure, and they're challenges that are difficult to address, but I do think the India study, which wasn't a clinical trial, but they had a great model that worked well for remote. So there are some opportunities to consider there.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Mark, did you want to comment?
I was just going to say, I think it's partly commercial viability, but I think the big problem in the field of complications for type 1 diabetes is I think we need a worldwide network to get the number of patients for the trials. The complication progression rate is fortunately not so fast as it used to be. So that means we need more patients, and we probably need something like the networks that the immunologists have developed worldwide for their trials. I think unlike type 2 diabetes, this has to be global. And I think here the great opportunity would be with Europe, because Europe has a real interest in diabetic complications. They have a great public health network. They're very good at finding these people, and they run a health system that's similar to Australia. So I think this is what we need, and I think this is where JDRF can help us globally to build a proper worldwide clinical network for trials.
Mm-hmm. And Sanjoy, we were talking about this before. What do you think?
We have
to get creative around the time.
Yeah.
The conversation we are having with the cardiorenal division and with Norman Stockbridge and Alyssa Thompson at FDA is for therapies that are approved for non-type 1 diabetes complications like CKD, type 2 diabetes, nephropathy, or cardiomyopathy. With them, can we use the concept of a bridging biomarker, which has a very strict definition under FDA parlance, using a bridging biomarker to allow for an abbreviated type 1 study.
Yep.
So that's point number one. Point number two, we have been meeting with the FDA and pushing the envelope on this. While they have been non-committal, in a workshop that JDRF led on SGLT inhibitors, they had, in a non-committal way, did agree to considering a shorter trial in type 1 diabetes, but therapies that have the safety profile in a non-T1 indication. Last point, we were very encouraged by the label that sotagliflozin or Zynquista got for heart failure. So if you read the label, particularly read between the lines in the label, type 1 diabetes is not an exclusion, as it has been in every other label. And not only that, they haven't included type 1, but they have also alluded to or directly referred to diabetic ketoacidosis risk mitigation if you were to use it in people with type 1 diabetes. And remember, the heart failure trial with sotagliflozin did not have any patients with type 1 diabetes. So I think it's moving in a direction we would like it to move, because we can't do M&M studies in type 1. We'll never have the number, even if we have the money.
That's right.
So that's the thing.
Yeah, thanks for that. And just to also announce that the Australian Centre for Accelerating Diabetes Innovation, in collaboration with the Australian Diabetes Society and other organisations, we are trying to establish Australasian Diabetes Clinical Trial Network, which will just be a facilitatory network to try to distribute information about clinical trials and opportunities for people, and this will obviously include people with type 1 diabetes, and we'll have JDRF membership in that working group. So hopefully we can increase participation that way. So I'm just going to, this afternoon session was fantastic, and when Sybil, when you're talking about technology, and there are obviously, I've worked in Indigenous communities for a long time, and there are people with type 1 diabetes in communities, not as frequent obviously, and work in other communities where people just don't have access to insulin pumps, and they just can't afford private insurance. So I guess the question is around how, for people who want to have access to insulin pump therapy, how do we work towards making this happen for adults, particularly because there might be more opportunities for younger people. So I'm going to throw to, so Tim and Sybil, I might get you to both comment on this.
I think you're right, it is easier in young people because you can get philanthropic donations for people who don't have insurance, but it's still, I think especially with HCL now, I think everybody needs to be funded. It has to be a priority for all of us as a group to advocate for that. But we need the data. We've got the data's there. We need to put it in a case and make a case.
We've got the experts here.
And the economics of it's pretty clear.
Josh is here too. So what do you think? And Sybil?
Certainly from the adult point of view, I think it's important that we also look overseas. So interestingly, in the UK, the NHS now is one of the first places to subsidise pumps and CGMs for people with type 1. So they've had these mass start clinics of starting automated insulin delivery for people who weren't previously on either. And they've actually been able to show in their models how successfully you can do mass starts. So I think I understand New Zealand has pump funding but not yet CGM funding, and if their CGM funding comes through next year, they will also be in a similar situation. So I think here, as Tim says, the advocacy and the collecting their health economic data early on is very important. We aim as researchers and clinicians to do our bit where we can to get the evidence and to find out what people want, but I think that it's also bigger than that, because we need the people with the pots of money and the political control to have buy-in.
And this question would be good to get your views, Josh and Jane and Ben as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the difficulty is that for pharmaceuticals and for...
Mine's now on.
We've got clear pathways, we've got clear advisory committees that sit 3-4 times a year. So the pathway for seeking reimbursement and funding is clear, guidelines are available. Whenever we don't fall neatly into those kind of, is there an MBS item, is there a pharmaceutical that we can list on PBS, the pathway becomes opaque. It's less clear. And that's both with regards to hospitals and health services, and also other sort of government level fundings for screening programs, for example, but as well as this for devices. So when we're looking at pumps, it falls into this difficult pot, and it's hard to get the right and identify the right person at the other end of the table to put the value proposition together. I think there has been modelling already being done, and for Australia, I haven't looked at it close enough to go, well, where is the uncertainty, and do we need a bit of extra real world evidence just to sort of pop in and sort of say, well, assumptions that people have a pump and then never touch it or just leave it in the drawer, that's a fallacy, but that's from a funding's point of view. If you're paying up front for the cost, you're only getting the value if it's used, you probably want to address that uncertainty. But I think that's a fallacy, but probably a concern. But making sure the right person's at the other end of the table, and then being able to sit through and work through, okay, what are the concerns, what are the areas of uncertainty, and let's, if need be, implement with additional evidence gathering.
I've got strong feelings about this. I think pump funding in Australia is broken. It was less of an issue a decade ago when MDI versus pump minor improvements. Now, hybrid closed loop is an absolute game changer. The outcomes are clearly evident over many years. The cost-effective analysis was done in 2020 at Monash. It shows that in terms of Australia's willingness to pay, it meets the criteria. I'm not sure why we're not more coordinated in sort of moving toward. I know JDRF have done great things. They've The pump program's gone from 18 years old to 21, but as we know, plenty of people that are adults have type 1 diabetes. They can't access the standard of care in type 1 diabetes. There's a disparity in remoteness, age, and socioeconomic status amongst many other things. And only 50% of people have private health insurance. You need decent coverage for private health insurance to get the pump as well. So I'm sure it's less than that can actually access the pump.
Thanks. Jane?
Yeah, I mean, just bringing on with Ben's point there and coming back to the issue of stigma, because I do think we have a big problem with diabetes stigma, not just in this country but globally. And I think it's not just about how people feel and how it impacts on their self-care or their own quality of life, but I think it's also impacting considerably on public and government perceptions of diabetes as a condition and of people with diabetes. And I think this is a big problem for researchers, for health professionals, for everyone involved in this community, because we need government and public support for these kinds of expensive technologies, but the costs of the complications, both the personal, the social, the economic costs further down the track, are far more than the costs of these technologies and providing them to support people in their everyday lives. So we really do need to change the perception of diabetes, that this is not a condition where we blame people for getting diabetes, that we blame them for having hypos or complications, regardless of what type of diabetes they have. This is an issue that's actually affecting all types of diabetes at the moment. So that's my take on it, is that we actually need to address that issue, and then we will be able to address this. And I think, you know, JDRF and Diabetes Australia and others do, you know, a great job of lobbying government, but actually I'm going to call JDRF out on this, because I think when you take hundreds of children up to Parliament, you tell government and the public that this is a children's disorder, and it's not. It's a condition that affects adults too, and we need to get support for adults with diabetes too. And I think CGM has been fantastic for children, and the access has been great that we've got that, but we need it for adults too, and actually the evidence is stronger for adults. So.
Thanks. And Fergus, I was going to ask you, from a clinical experience, where you have potentially more access to pumps, do you find people, you know, take the technology up, or?
So I agree with Tim. We're in a protected spot. If we want to put a child on a pump, by one way or another, they're going to end up on a pump, whether it's through their own resources or philanthropic resources. But as Jane's highlighted, we have a lot of patients who, despite that, elect not to go on pump for whatever reasons. And we've got to be very careful that we don't sort of, there's an implication, there's two standards of care suddenly in a clinic. You know, you've got gold standard care if you're on a pump, and you've got something less if you're not. And that becomes a sort of implication that if we put all our emphasis on advocating for technology, and if you're not on technology, you're somehow getting a second-rate standard of care. So I think we've got to be, you know, I come from the prism of a tertiary children's hospital. You know, equity of care is our absolute number one sort of priority, I guess, and outcomes. And we look at everything through that prism.
Thanks. And Sybil?
Can I put a little counterpoint on that? I guess working in a public adult hospital where we really have no access to pumps for people who can't purchase them on their own, I guess, and as a very technology-centric clinical and research practice, I don't think we would advocate that it's the pumps for everyone at all and there's first and second rate. What we would advocate for is choice for all.
Oh, totally. No, exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I guess when I talk with people about considering going on a pump, it's not a life sentence for the next 4 years. You can go on and off your pump, and I guess I almost put it out to the room here. Why do we not have subsidies for pumps for everyone? Someone in this room might know what the gap is. Do we need to do some more research? Do we need to have collaborations that aren't yet happening? Like, it almost baffles me why we don't have funding for pumps.
Did you want to make a comment, Mike?
The simple answer is there is no economic case yet the government would be willing to fund. And that's why, for CGM and pump access provided to date, it has not been created through normal processes of assessment. It's been created by patient advocacy.
Right.
And that's unfortunate, because if there is an economic case that stands on its own 2 feet, it gets its own momentum. So I think there's a combination of
Yeah.
Is it the economics not done, or the economics doesn't add up?
The latter.
Doesn't add up.
So,
Right.
Joshua, I think, can I just ask you, you said there's a pathway for getting these technologies on the market. So can you tell us a bit more about that? Because I just don't get a sense that that pathway is as clear for technology as it is for medications.
Sorry, that was my point actually.
Okay.
Sorry. If it's a medical service, so getting the D&E and the, seeing an endo, having your pump fit out, their item numbers, that's through MBS, you can charge that. And if you want to get changes to those items, those attendances, clinical attendances, as well as diagnostics and blood procedures, the Medicare has a very structured way of meeting 3 times a year through its Medical Services Advisory Committee to review and assess new applications for items on the MBS. For pharmaceutical benefits schedule, it's very similar. Once we go into technologies, it's a different process. So when we're looking at pumps, you have a item number associated with that, and then it goes through to the PLAC, which is the Prosthesis List of Australia, and then it sort of considers it separately, but that prosthesis list is then only considered in terms of for private hospital insurance and things, and it's still a hospital choice whether or not they consider or want to choose to have a pump program and pay for pumps and through that system.
Is that similar for, say, cardiology with the cardiac monitoring and so forth, do you know?
So implantable devices, and that's where pumps is kind of a special case because it's not implantable, but it's still considered in the prosthesis list, whereas implantable devices get treated slightly differently. And again, it goes into more hospital health services, and each hospital district then making that choice with their clinicians leading whether or not that's the standard of care or the care that they wish to choose. But at least through the activity-based funding back into the Commonwealth, states can get that funding for it. So it gets complicated, it gets messy, but when we're looking at devices, it's even messier than a nice straight pharmaceutical or a nice straight attendance.
Okay.
I just wanted to add to that as well, sorry, just in the audience. There is actually no HTA process for devices.
Yes.
So this is the challenge, right? So if you were to actually look at the quality years, which is what you do in pharmaceuticals, you work it out, it's very clear, you have a certain number of quality years, you get funding. That's actually been proven with pumps, but there is actually no process. So what I would encourage everyone to do, it's good timing because there is actually a parliamentary inquiry at the moment into diabetes, is to actually make this big. And I know JDRF are working on this, but it's really about let's just have a transparent process. And if there's a transparent process, everyone can go through that process. The onus is on the companies to prove that it actually does fit what the government require, but at the moment that doesn't exist. So there's all these technologies sitting there that could actually be funded, but by lack of process it doesn't get there. And to your question with cardiac, it exists in cardiac. So it exists.
All right, okay,
in
so it's up to us, the community, to do something.
It's just about creating an HTA, which
there you go.
Diabetes.
Please put this in your application, in the parliamentary inquiry submissions, I should say. And Jeffrey?
So I wonder if we've got this conversation the wrong way round. We seem to be talking about economic costs and economic value. But this is about investment, and it's about Australian values rather than cost and economic value. Australia is, by the World Bank data, the 10th wealthiest country in the world, and that includes the oil-rich states in the Middle East. If we think about what we're talking about as something that is important from an investment point of view, and that our values in society are such that this should be funded, then there should be no question about that. Yes, we might have to advocate to government or whoever, or participate in a Senate inquiry, but we have the capacity to decide how that wealth is spent. And if this is important, then we should invest in it. The other thing is, I mentioned when I spoke...
But how do we do that?
Hang on. I mentioned when I spoke, well, we would advocate, wouldn't we? We would do more advocacy. But when I spoke, remember, it was about 3 weeks ago, about 60-30-10. The 30 is how much in the health system is inefficiencies or treatment that shouldn't be done, or under-treatment or over-treatment, or test results that never get seen, or bureaucracy that stifles being able to treat patients readily, or whatever, okay? Inefficiency in the system. We only have to liberate a bit of that to have far more money in the system to pay for all the good care we want to create. So it's within our wherewithal to redesign the system, and it's within our wherewithal to have values in Australia that say this should be funded.
Yeah, but how do you kind of change that thinking? I mean, this is a very discrete thing. That's a whole change in processes, yeah?
20 odd years ago, I was in the UK and part of the Daphne study group, the dose adjustment for normal eating. And we did a clinical trial led by Simon Heller, Stephanie Amiel, Sue Roberts. And the Daphne program is a 5-day structured education program for people with adults with type 1 diabetes. And we demonstrated that it improved HbA1c, that it didn't increase severe hypoglycemia, that it improved quality of life and well-being and treatment satisfaction and all the things. And then everyone tapped themselves on the back and thought, fantastic, we've got a trial, we've got a paper published in the BMJ. What now? Because this is a program that takes 5 days to deliver to a group of 8 people. And that's, you know, problematic, because how are we going to be able to support that in the NHS? And so we went to the Department of Health in the UK and we advocated for the evidence that we had, and we used the argument that Jeffrey's just talked about, that there's a whole lot of stuff that was going on at the time that was not evidence-based, and that we needed support to be able to roll this out across the country. And the rest is history, because we now have 50-odd thousand people who've been through the programme. We've had 20-odd years of Daphne training in the UK, and it's in most major type 1 diabetes centres.
It's very good.
We have it here.
And I guess I'd just say that to defend the economists, it's actually more about health outcomes and the value. It's just simply that we use quality adjusted life years, and we can debate the extent to which they capture and truly reflect societal values, and what else is not captured within that kind of measure. But really, from the health economic argument, it's there to maximise those. We're not here to penny pinch and cut costs. We're here to deliver patient outcomes. But I guess it's just within the context that we've only got so much budget that we can invest in. And whilst disinvestment is a fantastic idea, and I would almost like to see these ideas where we put new investment funding attached to where we're going to get that money out of existing systems. That'd be wonderful. But if we look at the last, 15, 20, 30 years of disinvestment kind of research and abilities to try and disinvest, very hard. Hard to take away the lollies from the kid that you've already given it to, right? So that's wonderful, but I think health economics is still great. Yes, we need to work on values and making sure we include those. B, it needs to be within a governance structure and a systematic and equal effective approach. I'd say advocacy's got a role, but it needs to be fair for all, not just those with the squeaky loudest wheels. Even though I can wear my patient hat as well. But and then at the flip side of that, disinvestment is wonderful, but let's be real in terms of it's really hard to get that disinvestment.
But it can work the other way too, right? With the no longer access to finger pricks for people with type 2 diabetes who are not on insulin. So it can work the other way.
And we weren't attacking you, Josh. Some of our best friends are health economists.
any
then I feel very sorry for you.
Director.
Yes, so I have a question to the panel. We were, in the last couple of days, we were really thinking and hearing about the really kind of fast pace of new treatments coming into the type 1 diabetes world. We're talking about screening, we're talking about primary prevention, secondary prevention, a replacement, of stem cells, all those kind of things coming up. I just, in 2023, we have 50 years since the first insulin pump was, presented as this huge kind of backpack of a thing. So it's 50 years, and we're sitting at the panel now and we're discussing still lack of access. So that's pretty daunting for, let's say, Vertex therapy to come in if we don't have a pathway for it. So if we were to take each new treatment and technology each by one, I think it will be an exhausting process for everybody within the ecosystem. So I just wonder, what can you say about changing the way that implementation is done in the first place? So we don't have to fight for each new therapy and each new technology one by one, because that's going not really probably to keep up with the pace of what's happening in type 1?
It's a great question, and I think it also is the key for the adjunct therapies too, not just the technology, but the medications as they come, especially for this population, like GLP-1 therapies.
I think we can take a page out of the Brits book here. In paediatric diabetes in the UK, outcomes have been totally transformed in the last 10 years, and that was through a national program underpinned by their database, their national database, and basically by coalescing centres, by providing financial incentive to follow guidelines to put more kids on technology and the like. And that has been unbelievably successful. And I think, to come to Dorota's point, it hasn't cherry-picked different types of care. It's just said this is an overall standard of care that will change with time. So, and that will be reflected in clinical practice guidelines. And if you can keep up with that, if you can align to that, then you will be, as centres, financially rewarded. And that has progressed unbelievably. And I think there's a lot to be learned from that.
Yeah, and I got a sense from the Health Minister that they're actually thinking of going down that pathway. Recently when they were doing the Medicare review, did you?
No, I missed that.
But
having my coffee.
I don't know if other people, they were sort of hinting at that just recently with the Medicare review, like Medicare's broken, this is not working, maybe we need to move towards that type of model of care, looking at outcome-based. So now, any other people in the audience? So I guess a question that is obviously asked is, the way the regulation works in our countries, obviously certain people sit on certain boards and with expertise and actually make decisions which are recommended, but we often don't have the person living with the condition represented at the table. And I guess I just wanted to get a sense of who you think should be at the table to make access more equitable and address the need for specific communities, for example, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, or people with other disability, or people living in rural and remote areas. I mean, is there any sort of things that we could do to try to get their views and their perspectives? Because we don't hear their voices that often.
Thanks. Yes, I completely agree that you need that diversity at the table. You need representation from Aboriginal communities, from people in remote regions, and I mean, primary care is another big one, particularly the Aboriginal community-controlled health sector in primary care. It's critical, and that's another link with community as well. So, yeah, I think bringing and there are peak bodies there, for example, with Aboriginal community-controlled organisations that make some of that those connections more feasible. But bringing together key partners, I think, is critical.
Yeah, and I think, for people undertaking clinical trials and research, it's really important to think about that from the outset, as we've talked several times now about co-design. And, thankfully, the group, the research field is moving that way. It should have been like this for many years, right? We need to really think about people who are, when you're putting in grant applications and so forth, like who is going to be who are the representatives in the community that you're researching? And there are many advocates in this room. I'm not sure if Renz is here, but Jane, like how important it is to have the actual voices heard of the people affected by the condition. And I think in this day and age, you shouldn't put in grant applications without that, thinking about that and getting that properly done and actively involved. Did you want to comment on that?
Well, I think you know where I stand on that, which is absolutely people with diabetes need to be at the table. They need to be front and centre in all of this decision making right from the start of research processes. The ideas we're talking about, how do we get people into clinical trials? We design the most complex trials, the most burdensome trials for people, and then we expect them to all take part in this as though it's nothing, and we're actively not appreciating the burden and the amount of time that it takes out of people's day and their working lives and so on. I mean, the amount that everyone had to do for the hybrid closed loop trial, the amount of clinic visits that they had to do, never mind wearing the technology and all of the assessments that we might need, but just the amount of monitoring that needed to happen. So it's no wonder that people don't necessarily come along and say, oh yeah, I can do that, because it's not one thing, it's actually several things over several assessments, and sometimes sitting around in clinics for several hours at a time. And I'm involved in a study at the moment where we're designing a very complex study internationally. And we're putting together the questionnaires, and some of the other investigators are saying to me, can we just take one of those questionnaires out because of participant burden? And I'm like, okay, why don't you take one of your clamp studies out of this trial? Because, you know, we've just got so much going on in these trials, and we're not really asking people what they would do or what they're prepared to do. We're not involving them in that process well enough. Mm-hmm. But I think the flip side of it for us as researchers is also that our research funding is actually woefully lower than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And actually we need to do a heck of a lot more these days for it. So when we're involving people, you know, human participants, not mice and rats and so on, but people with diabetes in studies, we need to be co-designing, we need to be involving them right from the start. We need a steering group of people with diabetes involved in you know, leading the study, in co-designing it and so on. And actually our research is just not funded for that, and as researchers we're not geared up for that. So I think we need far more support around doing all of that from the researcher perspective, as well as the support on the side of the people with diabetes, many of whom, you know, want to participate but may actually feel kind of overwhelmed or intimidated by the process.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. And we had a question here.
Yeah, I just maybe want to take this a step further. So when I'm teaching my medical students, I go to the end of the clinic and I say, okay, so who's in the biggest trouble? And it's a trick question, because the answer is the ones not here. And that's the challenge, is that we don't build it around the people who actually have the biggest need, because their voices are very difficult to hear. And in my talk yesterday, I showed that data that everybody knows about. The peak in HbA1c's at the age of, rising from the age of 12, 13 up to 25. That's right. And everyone just holds their head in their hands and goes, oh God, not them. Rather than thinking, those are the people we really need to get out to. And when we did that study, one of the discussions was had is, it's all the fault of the adult endocrinologists. They don't have an open system, they're not suitable, etc. And then when we began to realize that the rise was happening under pediatrics as well, it's everybody's problem. And learning how to engage with these people, in other words, young people, is what we need to do. We need to take it to them. And they don't want to wear the pumps, and they want this, and they want the other. So I'm just taking it a step further to say, and I love the talk about the Northern Territories, you know, let's take it right out there and start them designing things rather than us coming from them, but particularly the people where the voice is really not heard.
And I think the trap is in funding. You almost have to write your protocol there and then. You don't get that opportunity to do that. But that's where I think we can work as a diabetes community to sort of advocate for, you know, funding for pilot, like actual discussion and consultation and engagement with community. So that's got to be somehow part of the application, and then at the same time, the application has to be thorough enough to be able to convince the reviewers, right? Yeah. Any comments from researchers in the room?
Centres like Ekinci are useful there, or CREs, or for those small grants for community engagement for PhD students or early career researchers. I think those big collaborations are where you get a bit more flexibility in funding.
Absolutely, and we've got the Ekinci community group. So any new projects, we have the opportunity to run it, and you're part of that. Ben, you want to comment on the experience with that?
And not just co-design of services, but co-design of research, and then having patients on the panels.
Yes, and yes, absolutely.
Increasing that's happening, and that certainly sharpens up the research community when it knows that the panel isn't going to be erudite experts, you know, with professorial hats, but there's patients on the panels. Of
course, and JDRF's very good with that.
Yeah, I think you're rediscovering the wheel. The JDRF's been doing this for more than 20 years. I think that's been, in actual fact, we've had actually less interaction, unfortunately, with the newer system of grant review than we had previously when we used to go to New York and let's say there'd be 15 people in the room, 5 were lay members, some were medicos who by chance had type 1 diabetes, so they had, in a way, a double role because they also were very au fait with the science. So I think JDRF's really the role model for this concept, and we know how good the lay members were, and of course if they become regular members on the panel, they become very expert as well. And so not only are they lay members, they end up, because the truth is you don't have to be a scientist or a medico to understand what to do in type 1 diabetes. It's good, and if you have type 1 diabetes, that's another advantage. But there are even people who don't have type 1 diabetes but might have an association, a family association or another link. They're very useful too.
Thanks.
So I think it's a...
Yep, question from here, comment?
It's more like a comment. I'm a bit concerned with the direction this conversation is taking, because it's heading into a la-la land. Your comments may be well taken in terms of observational studies, the studies that do not involve industry partners. But for clinical trials, especially of drugs and devices, the industry is a critical partner. Without industry and their R&D, we are not going to make the progress you've seen in some areas like AP, for example, or some of the adjunctive drugs. And the industry is facing already a huge challenge in terms of compliance and regulatory requirements, what the trials should include. In our case, FDA dictates a lot of rules, and if you are thinking that patients can design or take a very active part in designing those clinical trials, I think it will scare the industry off and will make this collaboration even more difficult.
I'm not sure that's the case,
it's
because
like trying to put a square block in a round hole.
Not sure that's necessarily the case in the experience that I've had with clinical trials, and there's clinical trial coordinators here. A lot of information is, nowadays they even do interviews in pharma trials. Are there any clinical trial coordinators here in the room? Also, I think what we're not getting is you mentioned it in your presentation, the emotional, the snips, the comments that people can make about how they're feeling at the time. That could be incorporated. What's it called?
Ecological momentary assessments.
Yeah. So I've noticed clinical trials are coming with interviews now with some of the trials we're doing. Did you want to make a comment?
The outcomes, which are usually glycemic based, very HbA1c, time and range focused, the actual data which is required to make a change lies in the outcomes. Those few words that the actual patient talks to you during the study visits. For example, one of my adult participants had mentioned when she was on standard pump and CGM therapy, towards middle of being on the closed loop, she said, I dread going back to the dinosaur age. That's how powerful their words are. And of course, the semi-structured interviews are now sort of inbuilt, at least in most of the clinical trials that we conduct, so that actually gives much more of a place for participants to actually provide what they feel about what needs to be provided.
Yeah, and I think I might ask Joshua, but can you think of examples? Because there are publications of the quality of life, effects of, say, new GLP-1 therapies or new technologies. How much of that information is actually taken into account when you're doing, when people are deciding on health economic?
It's huge, and the FDA will include and use quality of life for labelling, right? So we'll take it into account. I think just trying to balance out. So from an economic point of view, quality of life is key. It's one of the two key things that we're looking for in terms of underlying value.
So
quantity of life, survival, quality of life.
It's in the interest of industry to get that right.
Absolutely, and work with FDA, and FDA have got their own kind of sets in terms of patient-reported outcome measures, and then also plenty of examples in which health-related quality of life instruments within trials as secondary outcome measures have actually been and included on labelling and claims. So I think there are, from that element, in terms of including patient-reported outcome measures, kind of validated, verified with a priori constructs and everything else, plenty of examples and experience. I think what gets more interesting is then we talk about the actual design of the overall trial, and I agree in the sense that you know, if you've got a pharmaceutical company, they're very worried about what their statistical and analytical plan is going to be, how that design is going to be up. And it's unlikely that the primary outcome necessarily will be changed or influenced. But I don't think that means or excludes a role for patients, especially in terms of patient-informed consent, patient recruitment, and as well as secondary outcomes, or phase 4 studies, or additional studies alongside the primary. So I think, you know, it's not just a study often, it's a program of research and involving and including in many different areas patients can bring value.
Okay, thanks for that. Any final questions? Because Dorota, John?
Josh, just following on from that, do we have anything other than EQ5D, 5L to measure the quality of life? Because that's a big problem in our game and probably in the pump game and lots of other ones. Can you comment as to whether we can get something better, or is that what it is? We've got to do something that makes a significant impact on that scale.
So come on, Josh, get that organised, would you?
So there's a huge suite of instruments and tools.
But what's going to get you a health utility at the end of the day? Because that's what you need, right?
Yeah, so you can do it from the SF36, very common generic health-related quality of life. So the SF36 have algorithms to generate health utility indexes to generate qualities. We've got the EQ5D, we've got the AQUAL. AQUAL is actually a really good one, especially if you're including social connectedness and fatigue. So it's there, and it has utility indexes associated with it. We've got, there's HUE, there's heaps.
You're right, say asthma and cancer have their own, right? We don't have a diabetes-specific one. And as you said, we don't have a sleep... oh, no, but I mean, like, that's really sort of well uptaken, like the sleep's not in there, right?
So EQ5D, so that's what we call a generic, and then we have the disease specifics. And so Brazier in the UK, who's a leading expert in health-related quality of life, was doing some work in terms of generating a diabetes specific, which also included patient and treatment burden. Don't know, I don't have my finger on the pulse exactly where that instrument's up to. I believe it's developed. Brazier being involved means, and it's likely to also have a utility algorithm associated with it for us to be able to generate the weights that we need for our economic assessment. But we do always have this contention around sensitivity, specificity of, and how well we measure quality of life. And then the second argument of that is how well do we value that, and how well are the sort of societal preferences incorporated into those algorithms to be able to pick up a relative weight for any change in that measured health-related quality of life.
Can I just add to that? So I alluded to it in my talk that in the review that we did of glycemic therapies and quality of life, the EQ5D and the SF36 were not sensitive to the benefits of any of the technologies in the adult studies. So certainly not sensitive to differences between the technologies anyway in the trials. And the group at Sheffield have not only been doing that work that Josh has mentioned, but they've also been developing a measure that's going to be able to assess the impact of hypoglycemia on quality of life for health economic benefits as well. So that work's been ongoing as part of the HypoResolve study, and I think Jill published the paper about the development of that tool earlier this year, but the outcome tool will be coming.
I think Dorota's asking us to finish. So I guess one big take-home message is how important health economic analysis and how important it is to involve people with diabetes in these discussions. But I just want to, if you can join me in thanking the panel. Sorry we didn't get to talk in depth because we only had an hour, but thanks very much for being involved.